Moving on to the bass, they've done something a little bit interesting on this song, and they did it on a few songs on this record, and that is that they have a bass, which sounds like this, very straight ahead, I am a bass. Right, nice distorted bass, and there are a few plugins on it. I'll show you what those are. So there's 1176. This is all buttons in, and with the attack and release set where they are and how it's going, you can really hear the distortion that you get out of an 1176 with all buttons in. It sounds more like an EQ than a compressor, really. So let me play that for you again and check out what it's doing to the fuzz. It's quite cool. Compressor, distortion, you be the judge. Very cool. After that, there's a Sans amp on it, which I believe I added. Here's what that's doing. That's the actual drive part of this bass sound. Last in the chain on this fuzz bass is an L2, and I'll play you with and without, and basically we're going to get level out of this, but it's also going to help even out the notes so that it's really kind of a slab of bass instead of being notes quieter, notes louder, which will always happen with bass because the resonant frequencies in the room you record, the bass itself will have some dead spots, things like that. Here's with and without. It's just doing the job, bringing it up in level, but also every note's exactly the same level. Now, I'm using a limiter in this case because, first of all, a limiter is just a compressor with a very high ratio. That's it. 100 to 1 is the definition of now I'm a limiter instead of a compressor, which means you'd have to go up 100 dB on the input before you went up a dB on the output. So it's basically brick wall compressor is what it really is. And in my mind, when I think about compression, first of all, I don't use that much insert compression, as you've seen, unless I'm really going for an effect, an all buttons in thing, that kind of thing. Just because I always lose a little bit of the natural sound of the instrument. But the way I think about it in my mind is that with a compressor, you're pushing the tops down like that. Whereas with a limiter, especially one set up like the L2, as you bring that threshold slider down, it's like you're pushing your audio up against the ceiling. And whatever hits the top just starts to flatten out, but not in a purely square wave clipped way. It will start to even things out in a way where, because of the way the gain structure is, you're actually bringing up the quiet stuff and the loud stuff just can't get any louder. Now, another way you could solve this if it wasn't a fuzz bass and you really wanted to keep the character of the bass is with a parallel compressor. Then you can overcompress it, which will severely even out all the notes. It'll also bring up the reverb. But then as you blend that back in, what'll happen is, because the compressor is so consistent, it will sort of lessen the difference between the notes. So that's kind of a best of both worlds thing where you keep the purely natural sound of the uncompressed bass or guitar or whatever it is you're trying to even out, but you get a little bit of the dynamics control that comes from compressing the hell out of something. So the choice is between putting a compressor directly on the instrument, putting a limiter on the instrument instead, or using something parallel is just about how much of the original character you want to retain. And then you'll start to build up a library in your head of what sounds good in those three different modes, and then you just move on from there. Really quickly, here's without everything. Not exactly subtle, but that's okay. Now, a very cool thing that they've done on a lot of these songs is they've actually doubled the bass. Really just sounds like a picked guitar, but what this does when put in with the bass is it gives you some of that kind of Hofner, old school 60s, 70s sound, but on a distorted bass, which is really difficult to achieve. If you're playing it clean, you can absolutely get the tone of that Motown pick R&B mid-range bass, but you can't do that if you start adding distortion because the attack goes away. So rather than having a clean bass DI, where you're like fighting to get that mid-range to poke through the bass distortion, double it up an octave, and you actually get that kind of attack which is appropriate to the song on top of the fuzz bass, which is appropriate to the band. Once we have more of the instruments in, I'm going to come back to this because what you'll see is that they build, especially in the intro and the verses, they've got lots of people playing that part in different octaves. So the guitar is playing that, I believe the piano is playing that, and it just goes to be almost an orchestration effect. So the way Ravel would build pipe organ sounds out of 5 different instruments within the orchestra all playing the same part in different octaves, they do the same thing for the entire song, but in this case for the bass by having that octave bass. And then in certain sections of the song, they have yet another track, which is the octave down of the clean bass. So this is back in the regular octave of the bass, but it's just adding a little bit of weight, and it's not that loud, but here's with and without that bass. Just adding that definition back into the main octave of the bass, and then I'll leave all 3 of these tracks on, and you'll hear when that goes away and it goes just to the bass and the high octave, that the bass kind of cleans up a little bit. And that's also when the guitar stops doubling it, but the piano continues. So the timbre of this part changes, but the part continues. That's that great kind of transition from chorus bass to verse bass, but it's the exact same part, but it just tightens up, gets a little bit drier. It's very, very cool. And just in case you're wondering, there's another limiter on the 6-string bass. That is actually more to bring out the spring reverb that's on there. So I'll play you with and without, and obviously the level's going to come up like 3 dB or so, but you'll also hear more of the spring with this limiter than without it. So now you really hear the bubble of that spring reverb behind. Not a traditional bass, but it's quite cool. The only send that the bass is going to is the rear bus. Again, not going to talk about that till I've got the band built up, because it doesn't really do anything on its own. There is a bass crush imported from my template into the session, not being used. Never got used. Anyway, it's a long story. It's boring. You don't want to hear that. We get to move on to some new instruments. There's one main guitar that goes all the way through the song, and in the intro, you'll hear that this is actually doubling that main part that the bass was playing. It's really dirty, it's an inversion, so the interval is different, but if we put that with the bass, so you can hear harmonically, all of a sudden, we've gotten a lot more complicated because the difference between the bass and guitar on that low note, but they're playing the same top note. There's not a lot going on. The guitar was recorded this way. There's, again, the limiter and equalizer that they had on, which I'll show you. They're adding quite a bit of mid-range here. The combination of their compressor and EQ is just bringing out the attack of the guitar. The sustain doesn't actually sound a whole lot different, but you're hearing a lot more of the pick on the string, that kind of thing. That is the main guitar. And this guitar plays all the way through the song, though in the verse it switches to just backbeats. which again with the bass is a very cool juxtaposition now. So instead of playing together, now they split up. And I'll play the transition from intro to verse. So just like the bass tightened up, all of a sudden the whole track tightens up but gets more rhythmically varied. There's more going on, but at the same time there's a lot more room for the vocal. Just good arrangement, good playing, very cool tone. Down below that, we've got a fuzz guitar, which is just in the choruses, which is just doubling that main phrase, which is also on the main guitar. Reverby, fuzzy, we're not doing anything to that at all except sending it off to the rear bus. Now, there's this send here off to a plate on the main guitar, which, if I find that in the session, is reverb that they made. There's a plate reverb, which is actually the same reverb I normally use for my vocal verb. It's what's in my template. And this is something that they built. I believe they built it mostly for the horns, and then it stuck around and got used on the guitars. Really quickly, I'll show you the main guitar dry and wet, and you'll hear it mostly in the verses. Just takes the spring reverb from the amp, which is panned with the guitar, which is sort of mid-left, and it spreads it around the whole mix, which when the drums are going, you're not necessarily going to hear that, but it will feel a little more stereo, which is what they're going for. The other thing I want to point out, and it happens throughout this track, is how there's one chord in the middle of this verse that falls off. It's a little bit longer. Here, I'll play you one before it and then it. And it's just a little detail, and it probably happens where there's a hole in the vocal. But it might just be happening, and it's this great idea of the random human performance. So these parts are very worked out. The sounds are very stylized and specific, but within the sort of rigid definition of what it's going to be, everything is allowed to be sloppy and loose, and that's what makes this song exciting, because stuff keeps changing and moving. The tambourine and the shaker are not quantized at all. They're all over the place. The drums aren't quantized at all. So his groove is awesome, and every once in a while he rushes into a fill, and that's fine, because that's what drummers do. They get excited as they go into a fill, and then they settle back into the groove, and that's what makes it sound cool, and also it makes it sound a little bit more old school than if you had just lifted loops from the old records and played them at a strict tempo all the way through. So this fuzz guitar basically does doubling whenever there are riffs. All the way through, I don't think it ever plays anything on its own except in the second verse where it gets its own part. So we go from having just the backbeats to having the backbeats and the fuzz halfway through. If you remember what our bass does, it's actually going to start doubling the bass. So we're harmonically not adding anything new, but we're sonically building the song, and it's also starting to get more stereo, and especially when you remember that the drums are basically straight up the middle. Every new element that comes in that's off to the side is exciting and new. It's not just sort of placed within the stereo spread. There's a real spot for it to come out. There are a couple other guitars here, which I'll play you very quickly. There is this guitar, 4. And then there is guitar 5 doing a very similar thing. Now guitar 4 has a compressor on it. I believe they put this on. I'm sure what it's going to do is it's going to make this guitar much wetter being in, and let's see if I'm right. I win! It's wetter with the compressor. So that's really all it's doing. It's making the attacks not stick out quite as much, and it's making the sustain of that reverb really come out. It's also, you can hear, bringing up some hum that was in the guitar tone. A lot of times, if that's something that bothers me, I'll use one of the noise reduction plugins, either like Z-Noise from Waves, or obviously the suite of stuff from Isotope is ridiculous and can be much more precise than maybe you can get with some of the plugins that are trying to do stuff real time. But in this particular case, it just didn't matter. This is a dirty track. There was no point in cleaning it up. It's not that it might not have been better to have cleaned it up, but it's not hurting things to be a little bit noisy, so that's okay. These guitars are just going off to the rear bus. That's all they're doing. There's also pan automation, and one thing that maybe you noticed is as I was scrolling through the session we listened to the song, is a few of the tracks are showing automation lanes. I always leave the track showing the automation if there's something automated other than the volume. And it's just a reminder to me that it's automated, because otherwise I might decide like, hey, I want to mess with the panning on that guitar. And I grab it and I move it, and of course it's going to snap back because there are breakpoints on the track. I need to know that, and I can visually see immediately, oh yeah, I automated the pan on this guitar. So at the end, guitar 4 and guitar 5, just to be a little exciting, are panning themselves back and forth across the spectrum here. Goes from mono to stereo and mono to stereo, and the reverb is switching sides. The point of that is, let me put in the main guitars we've already heard. I mean, this won't be everything that's in there, because there's also piano and obviously the strings and all the rest of it. But within the context of this driving, repeated rhythmic figure that's going on, it just gives me more stereo motion once again. By having mono drums, all of a sudden, stereo becomes a huge element of the mix that I can use to create excitement, to create size, where a lot of times you start off very stereo, so there's not a whole lot that you can do in terms of just stereo panning that's going to really make a massive difference in the mix. In this case, it absolutely does. So here's that end section with bass and the main guitar and those two guitars panning behind it. Just more fun, and why not? And most likely I came up with that just because I felt like I was getting a little bit bored in that last chorus, and what can I do? Like, oh, pan this stuff around. Like, it worked. Move on. I'm sure this was not something when they said, okay, and at the end we'd really like these guitars to pan. This is purely based on, I need something to happen here. What do I do? And on a mix where all of the instruments are this stylized and this specific in terms of their task, sometimes it's harder to make stuff out of nothing, where I can't take a sort of generic sounding guitar and explode it into a reverb, like, because there's already spring reverb all over this thing. So panning becomes a place where I can generate excitement. These guitars here I'm not going to talk about yet, because these are actually for the transition into the middle 8. So this is part of what I created inside the middle 8, which we'll talk about all at once. The same with this middle 8 harp. This is an overdub that they did, but I'll talk about it in the context of the middle 8, and then below it is a track I created, which is a copy, some reverse stuff, things like that. Only other thing with the guitars is they're all going to a guitar bus. This, again, would have been something that the band did while they were working on the song. All of the guitars we've been hearing, and I'll go ahead and solo them up, are going through a Fairchild. We can hear what that's doing. Here, let me go to the end here. Doing what compressors do. It's just gluing them back together, bringing up a little bit of the ambience, and then another compressor, because why not? This is something that other people, not myself, actually do quite a bit, where you double compress. You do a slow compressor into a faster compressor. So one of them is doing much more about the glue and the sustain, which would be the Fairchild. And the other one is doing much more to do with the attacks of the guitars and things like that. That's the SSL. So what I'm going to do now is play you that guitar bus, and I'll bypass the two compressors at the same time because they really do go together to compress the guitars. So on their own, they're making a big difference, but the big deal is what they both do. They're actually quieter with the compressors, as they're not doing too much makeup gain. But it's just gluing everybody together. They're not sticking out. They're all working as a package. It's just saving me time. Again, all those guitars are going off to the rear bus. We're almost ready to listen to the rear bus, but not yet. There are a couple of main elements I want to get to, sort of band elements, because they're really part of everything else that we've already been talking about. This gets us into the keyboards, and basically there's a main piano track, and this is going to be doubling the bass or the guitar or both, or sometimes playing its own part. Really quickly, just show you what it's playing. Doubling the bass, and then in the verse it does the same thing. But just like with the bass, on the bass they've lost the low octave double. Here, they're losing the high octave, so we go to a cleaner sound. You don't hear as much of the rattle and that kind of mid-range growl that's on the piano. And then when we get to the B sections, more of a standard piano part. And then doubling the riff. So it's a reinforcement, but then in the B sections you get sustain like you would out of a guitar, as opposed to more of the rhythmic groove that you get out of the bass part. It's also a pretty lo-fi upright sounding piano, and there are some plugins on it. There's a decapitator, which I'll play you with and without. So pretty subtle, kind of the same thing I use lo-fi for, just a little bit of clipping. That is followed by a compressor at 20 to 1. So this is giving you that over-compressed kind of Beatles-y sound that we've all grown accustomed to hearing on those recordings. Really smoothing out the attack, bringing up the sustain, really just doing more of that kind of lo-fi thing they've got going on. And then, because I decided their decapitator wasn't doing enough, I put a little bit of lo-fi on there as well. Three things in a row that are all kind of doing the same thing, just making it a little more sustainy, a little less attacky, a little more old sounding. Like I was saying before, this piano goes together to be a huge part of the timbre of the parts that are going on. So every once in a while you absolutely hear the piano, especially at the end of that B section, playing chords, really a piano part. But elsewhere, it's just finishing the sound of the part. So we've got the low bass, we've got the high bass that's clean, we've got the low clean bass, we've got the picked weird fuzzy guitar with the spring reverb, and we've got the piano, and all of those together, along with our extra guitar in the intro, make the groove. So here is the 3 bass tracks, the 2 guitar tracks, and the piano track. Can really hear how you set up this 2-note riff as the motor of the song, but then you just keep changing it. You heard that higher octave come in halfway through the intro, then you hear both high octaves go away going into the verse, you hear the bass dry up, you hear the guitar stop following. So it's really clever and simple. It's not a big deal. It's not like it's magic, but it's very, very well done. So now I think we can actually start talking about the rear bus. What we're going to do now is go back up and unsolo, and we've got the core of the band here. There aren't strings and horns, which are a big part of this song, but in terms of building up the groove and the actual sound of the mix, we have all the elements we need. There are a couple other keyboards that I'll come back to in a second, but I want to talk about the rear bus first now that we've kind of got everybody together. Here's the way the mix sounds going to the rear bus. Remember, everything is going to the rear bus except the percussion, and the drums are turned down a little bit. So I'm going to turn that send back on. That's down -12. And I'm going to play you a bit of that, and then I'm going to go take the drums back out, and you'll hear why the drums are in the rear bus. All right, I'm going to do that again. So first half of the intro, the drums are in. Second half of the intro, they're out. Just a totally different sound. What needed to happen, because so many of the instruments are playing that same rhythm as the drums, is without the drums going into the rear bus a little bit, they sort of sit on their own. They're playing the same rhythm, but it doesn't feel as though they're as locked in as they are. I mean, rhythmically, this stuff is actually pretty tight in a really loose, groovy way. But it just didn't feel like the snare was sort of part of that backbeat. So, dung, ga-dung, ga-dung, dung, ka, which is where the guitar is going to take over in the verse. That didn't feel to me like it was there, and when I add it into the rear bus, it actually starts working. So as a refresher on the rear bus itself, that's down here. It is a multi-mono compressor. That is a key part of the rear bus, is it's 2 mono compressors. So something loud on the left only affects the compression on the left, loud on the right only affects the right. 1176 at 2-to-1, and I'm going to hit play again, and you'll see what sort of compression we're getting on this. You can see that the rear bus is sitting around -5. I never look to see how much compression there is in the rear bus. That really just sets itself as I'm building the mix. And sometimes I'll have a look at this and it's barely moving at all. Sometimes it's absolutely crushed. But 90% of the time I don't even look at it. Now, this particular plugin was chosen because I was matching hardware. This was part of my journey of moving from mixing on the console into the box. I used some old Blackface 1176s that were probably broken. They were very grainy and had this real push in the mid-range. So I went through every single 1176 plugin I could find, and this was the one that did that mid-range thing the most. But obviously, 2-to-1 is not available on any actual hardware 1176. Mine were at 4-to-1, but 2-to-1 this sounded right. I've got the attack as slow as possible, and that is just because that's the way I almost always use 1176s. The input and output gains were set to match the gain structure of what was going on with my hardware. The only thing I might ever change is the release time. Now, this release time is set about where I always had it set with my hardware. If you set it to the fastest release, what can happen is it starts to jump around and you can hear it pumping. But sometimes if the release is too slow, the rear bus turns into a slab. You kind of lose too much of the air in the mix. I mean, one of the things that happens with parallel compression is you give up clarity and space in the mix to get excitement and glue. I happen to be able to take quite a bit more of the excitement and glue over the clarity and space than other people. A lot of other people would think my mixes are way too dense. But that's the trade-off in terms of how much of something like the rear bus you use. But within that, this release time, if I'm feeling like it's too dense but I like the sound of the mix, I can come in here and speed up the release, and all of a sudden, it's not pumping quite as hard. It'll be pumping faster, but it doesn't stay down and just fill up like a bucket of glue poured over the mix. That's the only control I ever look at on here, and the only real key to this is it's multi-mono. That's because that's the way I like it. But if you're building your own chains like this, definitely experiment. I mean, I went through at least 7 or 8 different 1176 plugins before deciding this one was going to work. That's the case with all of these parallel chains. just mess around and try different stuff and try things that aren't multi-mono. Try it stereo and see what you like better, because the character of it is much more important than the sound of it. It will change the way stuff feels more than it changes the way stuff sounds. That's our rear bus. So now I can quickly get through the rest of the elements that are in this. In the B sections, we've got a nice little glockenspiel. Just doubling the top of those little arpeggios. And then we've got this pretty cool little organ that in that same section is playing little stabs. Little bit of EQ and compression on there. I'll bypass it for you, but it's not doing much. Compressor just evening it out. You can hear a little bit more of that slap delay. But this also does some very cool stuff in the verses. So you've got this little stab. In the middle of the verse, everything is very tight and picking, and that's sort of the only sustain. So I'm going to play from a little bit before that. Right where that little sustain on the guitar happens, and right there, and they're panned hard and left, all of a sudden you get this stereo ba that then goes away. It's very cool. In the next verse, it does the same kind of thing. It's all just little details, little stuff. Cool arrangement. This other track here is only in the middle 8. We haven't gotten there yet, and that's it for keyboards. There's not a whole lot going on. They're going to the mix bus and to the rear bus. Now, the other two main elements, and they're actually big players on this entire record, are the strings and the horns. The arrangements are awesome. The sound is awesome. It's very kind of old school, very natural sounding. So here's some horns that are, again, they do a lot of doubling of the main riffs, as well as harmonizing it, and they do have a couple of their own parts. Classic, really well played, cut kind of dry. Only thing that's going on is on the bari sax, which I'll solo up for you. I've put an R bass just to get a little more low end to push through, because once the track starts getting dense with the kick and the bass and things like that, then all of a sudden, something that might have sounded really big down low like the bari sax in a rough mix doesn't have room anymore to be as big, so now I've got to amplify it. It's doing quite a bit. It's adding sort of a lower octave to that, which to me just helps the horns sound as big as the rest of the track. And there are two ways you can go with horns. You can actually decide to filter them and make them very small, which is cool, and they can still sound big in a mix because they're poking out of this very small place. In this case, we wanted the horns to be big because, again, it's also about the contrast in the dynamics. They're playing this big wall over the intro, then you get to the verse, they drop out, and you're left with all the really tight picking stuff. It makes a huge difference in the dynamics. There's also this track called Horn Vortection. I think they had a vortex in the studio and they just ran the horns through it. There's also a brilliance, a little bit of mid-range EQ, as well as a trim flipping the phase, because obviously when they bounced through this piece of gear, it was flipping it over. And that's also going off to the plate a little bit, but not very much. You can see there's barely any. But I'll play the horns with and without that extra track. It's a lot of that great present mid-range is coming from this mix of the horns put through the vortex. I don't know exactly what the vortex was doing on it, but it sounds great mixed in with the rest of the track. There's a track called Horn Piece, again, part of the middle 8, not going to deal with it. So the horns come down into an aux, the horn bus, and that has the Fairchild and then just a high pass to get rid of some of the actual boom of that R bass. Let's just solo up the horns again. I'll play you with and without the Fairchild. Pretty straight ahead insert compression, and then this high pass is just helping tighten things up a little bit. Without it, you can hear that the bari sax is actually starting to sort of boom, and it almost sounds like a ground hum or something like that, like there's a constant tone that's coming out of that R bass. So this helps with a nice gentle curve to even that out and make it just sound like cool low end. From there, it's going off to the rear bus, as always, and it's also going to a spring reverb. This is just, whenever I want an old sounding reverb, you go for a spring. Soft tube spring reverb sounds great. I've used it on a lot of records. In this particular case, I'm using a stereo instance of it, but if I'm doing something that isn't sort of a wall of brass, because these brass are spread out, they're mostly on the right, you can see from the way the panning is, but they are spread. And I wanted it to wrap back into the mix, so I'm using a stereo reverb. So there'll be quite a bit of crosstalk between the left and the right side of the reverb, putting the horns into the right side of the reverb, but we get reverb on both sides. And really quickly, actually, let me put in a multi-mono version of that. And I'll copy the settings. Bypass this guy. Now with multi-mono, if something goes in on the right, it only hits the right-hand reverb. So these aren't panned completely, but we should see this reverb should be a little bit more right-heavy. Otherwise, this is a pointless exercise. It sounds pretty similar, but I can hear it kind of wrapping around to the left a little bit. It's not a huge difference, but what's good about multi-mono reverbs is if you're trying to place them precisely, like let's say you've got a spring reverb you're adding to some guitars, some very tight guitars, you can decide where you want to pan the guitar anytime, and if the send is set to follow main pan, the reverb will follow that guitar precisely. Whereas if you're just going off to a stereo reverb, you've got this wash of reverb behind the guitar, so it's going to sound much less like an amplifier reverb and more like a mix reverb. So that's the difference between multi-mono and stereo reverbs in the way I use them. So that's horns. Strings, again, pretty straight ahead. Have a listen to them. Very well recorded. Beautiful texture. They're a little bit lo-fi. Now these are in fact mono, and then they're being panned about, well, panned 63 to the left, so more than halfway left. So again, they're not quite as narrow as the horns, but these are meant to be treated as instruments that you can pan. So I'm not looking for a wash of strings. This is very much meant to be mixed like mono elements placed in the stereo field, and they all do their jobs. And then at the very end, and also in the middle eight, things are panning all over the place. And it gives the great contrast, rather than having this big stereo mix the whole time, and then I just try to make something exciting by panning. That doesn't really work because I've already got stuff panned all over the place. These are discrete elements that do a job, and with the way the guitars are panned, the strings are panned, and the horns are panned, they all go together to make a stereo song. This is the best way I can think of to describe it. So on the string bus itself, another limiter and EQ that they popped on here. Pop that off for you so you can hear what's going on. Not much. Little bit of compression, no EQ. And then I'm actually putting a lo-fi on there. This is something where if it's hard to hear horns or strings, sometimes making them sound worse is the way to go. Filtering, distortion, that kind of thing. And all of a sudden, it's much easier to hear them in the context of the mix. much more present with that lo-fi on there. And again, they're going off to the plate and to the rear bus. That's it for the strings, except for an extra room track, which doesn't make it into the string bus because I actually wanted that to be stereo. They'd recorded the stereo room. This gives me a little bit of a wash underneath that actually lets me have a stereo wash in this second V section as opposed to the mono string. So it's just a way to grow the arrangement. I decided not even to use the room mic earlier on and then later leave it stereo and have that spread the strings out underneath a little bit. In the middle 8, there are actually some pizzicato strings, which they've only recorded the room tracks of. That gets us into some of the madness that is the middle 8, so I'm going to leave those alone for now.